The following is a very true experience. I've never actually written this down before, and I don't know if anyone has experienced this too. This happened between 89 and 90, and I was about the age of 4 at the time. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it, and I wonder if in some way unknown, it changed me. My parents had a house in the Inland Empire of Southern California, and at the time, my brother hadn't been born yet, so I was still the only child. To give you a layout, my parents' house was a 2-story house located in a cul-de-sac. On the bottom floor, there was 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, the living room and the kitchen. The second floor was just the master bedroom and bath. All you could see from the street was the garage and one of the bedroom windows on the bottom floor, and the window of my mom's bathroom on the second floor. To get to the front door, you had to walk along the cement pathway that ran along the side of the house. You had to pass the first bedroom that you could see from the street. Then you passed the bathroom window, and then another bedroom window. And then you would be at the front door. The backyard was beyond that point. My bedroom at the time was the bedroom next to the front door. Now, for some reason, my blinds weren't completely down to the bottom of the window. There was about a 6-inch gap with nothing covering it. I was pretty young, so I didn't really care much about it then. The bed was in the middle of the wall across from my bedroom door, and to the left was the window. According to my mom, this all happened right before midnight. My mother was asleep in her room upstairs, and my dad was a policeman that worked nights in another city. I was fast asleep in my room, and out of nowhere, I suddenly awoke, looking up at the ceiling. I don't know what woke me up, or if I just popped awake on my own. After my eyes adjusted to the night's light of my bedroom, I sat up and started looking around my room. All of a sudden, something caught my eye at the window in the gap. First, I thought it was the streetlights reflecting on the window, but I knew for a fact there was only one streetlight, and that I was looking at 2 obvious glowing spots that were spaced apart as if it was an animal's face. Then I thought, is a cat looking at me? And yes, I vividly remember thinking these things, trying to debunk this at 4 years old. I had remembered then that my cat Chelsea's eyes would reflect at night. But this looked different than that. The cat's eyes would almost have different colors when reflecting. These were 2 very solid, bright, amber, glowing eyes, looking straight at me. I just stared at them, frozen stiff, trying to make sense out of what I'm seeing. I couldn't see a face at all. The eyes were just so bright, and nothing else stood out. That void or face around the eyes looked blacker than the night, but looked in the shape of a big wolf head. I thought again, well, if this is a cat, how would a cat be big like a person, and why would a cat stand up and stare in my room? The curiosity got to me, and I went for it. I flipped my covers off, turned my little 4-year-old body towards the window, and put my feet on the floor. This is the moment the creepiest thing happened, and it will forever be burned into my brain. I got off the bed and got on my knees to get a closer look at this so-called cat, when at this very moment, these pair of glowing eyes begins to slowly and steadily tilt to the side. Very similar to Michael Myers in Halloween. Eyes are still locked on me, not blinking once. The feeling of dread and fear shot through my body. Completely terrified, I burst into tears immediately and booked it down the hallway, through the living room and up the stairs to tell my mom. Although I was going as fast as I could, it felt like it took forever. When I got to my mom, I was so upset. I couldn't get any words out. Tears were streaming down my face, and my mom was becoming seriously concerned at this point. She was able to calm me down just enough for me to get the words out. Their red eyes looking at me through my window on the bottom, stuttering and crying hard. "Are you sure?" my mom asked, and I just cry out yes. She didn't even go to look, she just called the police. I don't remember the time it took for them to arrive or what they said because I finally fell asleep in my mom's bed. I do remember faintly waking up to a knock on the door and my mom going to open it. The cop speaks to her and I hear her say, "Okay, thank you, good night," and he shuts the door. "Did they find it, Mommy?" I asked half asleep. "No, honey. He said they couldn't find anyone," my mom told me softly. "It's okay now, just try to go back to sleep." It's safe to say that the next day, my whole window was covered. Years fast forward and I'm in middle school. Every now and then I would think about that night. Sometimes I wondered if that moment was real, if those eyes were really there, those unforgettable, amber-colored eyes. One day, a random thought came up and I asked my mom if she remembered that night. She tells me, "Yes, of course, why?" "I don't know, just wondering," I said. Then my mom proceeds to say, "Well, I never told you this, but when the deputy came out that night, he told me they made it a priority to get out to our house as soon as they could, because not very long before I called 911, they received another call from someone else reporting that a large dog was looking in their window, and our same neighborhood." Hearing that sent chills down my spine, and to this day I wonder, what was looking at me that night?
I've seen 2 of them in my life. Things I believe were werewolves. The first when I was around the age of 14, and the other not too long ago. I live in the southern part of Kansas, so there's mostly just countryside where these sightings took place. As for my first encounter, I lived out in the countryside of Kingman County, where my closest neighbor was around a mile away. My parents would let me take nighttime walks during the summer, which was when this happened, the summer of 2012. I was on one of my routine walks down to the paved road about 1.5 miles away, then I would walk back. On the way down south to the paved road, there was a group of trees that always kinda scared the childish part of me. It was so dark, and you could always hear animals in there. Well, I would always jog past that part at night, then go along my way to the end of the dirt road. I remember running past this patch of trees, almost freezing when I heard what sounded like coyotes. And that's when I saw what I honestly thought was one of the nearby farmers doubled over in his field. It wasn't unusual for farmers to be out working at night. It was cooler than the day, that's for sure. So I slowed down to look over to see if he was all right. This figure, crouched down in the middle of a wheat field to my left, almost seemed to sense that I was watching it. I know this because it looked up directly at me, and I felt my heart start hammering in my chest, while these horrible, malevolent eyes began to glare at me. My body was screaming to run, just run the heck out of there and scream for help. But I couldn't move. You know how in the movies they always say how it feels, like you get frozen into ice, and you couldn't do anything but watch? That's not exactly what it was like. You see, it wouldn't know I was scared. I remember the thing stood, and it towered over me at about 6 or 7 feet tall. I mean, the field it stood in was at least 3 feet higher than the road, so I couldn't exactly tell what the height was for sure. I just couldn't take my eyes away from it, as I knew my impending death was sure to come. I just knew that they would find my body torn to shreds in the middle of this road, and that would be the end of Cheyenne as the world would know it. I've never been so scared. This werewolf took a couple of steps toward me, sniffing the warm breeze blowing from the south. Its eyes, a sickly yellow, still watched me standing there. It took another step before seeming to change its mind, and it got back on all fours and trotted to the patch of trees. I waited, petrified, my legs still screaming to run, while my brain told me to wait, told me it was a trap. So I waited, standing as still as possible, while my eyes scanned the trees in the field ahead. Minutes went by, before my phone went off with a text message. I knew I was screwed if it was still there, so I took out my phone anyway and looked at the message. "When are you going to be back? I need help with laundry." I couldn't believe it. I had just survived meeting a werewolf, and now I was going back to do laundry when I got home. I turned and began the too long walk back home, about 1.25 miles. When I met the grove of trees, I sprinted past, hoping that that creature wasn't still in there, watching me. Needless to say, I got home safe to help my mom with laundry. I never told her about my encounter, because I knew she would think I was a complete nut job. Now on to my second encounter. It took place on January 29th of 2017, around 3 in the morning. I live in Harper County, Kansas, with my husband. We were hanging out with his brother that night, playing Dungeons and Dragons. I know, yes, we're dorks, but it's our version of family fun. Well, around 2 a.m., I get cravings for ice cream, so we went to the next town over to Casey's to get some. The drive there was nice, with us singing along to music in the car. We ate our ice cream at the general store before heading back home. This time, instead of taking the highway, we went down the dirt roads. We went down one of the roads, 20th Avenue, for about 1 mile before I got this sick feeling in my stomach, like we were being followed. I knew there weren't any vehicles around because there were no lights at all, not even tail lights or brake lights, nothing. There was nobody around. So I turned and I started heading west for about 1 mile, but I still felt like there was something almost hunting us. So I turned, heading back south towards town, on a dirt road that many people in our county call Whiskey Road. A lot of people believe that that road is cursed or haunted because of how many wrecks there are on that road, and how many people have died there. Well, I figured since it goes straight to town, it would be our best bet. So we're going south for about 1/2 mile, when I asked my husband, "Are the car doors locked?" Now, with our car, the doors don't always lock when you press the lock button. The only way to be sure is to try to open the doors. "I don't know," he replies. "Do you want to stop and check? I'll open the doors and close them again to be sure." I shook my head, looking in the rearview mirror as I pressed the lock button a few times. I see that my husband's brother, who's 13 years old, is passed out in the back seat. "What's wrong?" my husband asks. "I feel like we're being followed," I answer quietly. I don't want to wake his brother up and scare him, but not by a person. More like something supernatural, he says. Now you should know that my husband and I are Wiccans. We do believe in magic and spirits and supernatural beings. Though together we haven't seen much, we tend to keep that hidden because many people in our town would kinda go on a witch hunt if they knew. So it wasn't unusual for us to have a conversation like this. "Yeah," I answered, before tapping the brake to go over a bump in the intersection. I could see now, in the taillights, that there was something behind us in the dust. I couldn't quite make it out, but I knew what it was. I knew, from that moment almost 5 years ago, exactly what I was looking at. I had told my husband a few times before of my encounter with the above-mentioned werewolf. I told him how it felt, how it was real, how big it was, and how terrified I had been. My husband was looking at me, curious as to what I was seeing. "Werewolf," I whispered, tapping the brakes again to see if I can make it out any better. I could feel that it had moved. You know when sometimes you feel like you're being watched, you can feel what direction it's coming from. I felt exactly like that. I could feel where it was following us from. To the back of the vehicle, near the driver's side. My side. I could not see it in the taillights, so I kept going, speeding up. I was terrified, knowing that the road was dangerous because of how many wrecks happen, but knowing that if that thing caught us, it could be much, much worse. At the next intersection, I tapped the brakes again, making sure to check both ways for any other cars. I looked in the rearview mirror, and I saw it again, but only its back haunches. The legs were human-like, but the ankles and feet resembled that of a wolf or dog. The thing had knees and thighs and shins, but from the ankle on it was all wolf. It was trying to hide in the dust, trying not to be seen, like a predator trying to get closer. My husband was worried, asking what we're going to do. I did not answer. I was too busy watching out the mirror and trying to watch the road at the same time. Can you see it?" he asks. He sounds scared. "It was behind us," I answer. We drive a little bit more, and I could feel it was back on my side of the car, but still a little bit behind. I was going around 40 to 45 miles per hour, so the fact that it was keeping up sent shivers down my spine. My head was pounding from all the pressure inside. With every brief glimpse that told me where it was, the fear inside me grew and was causing too much pressure to build up. I wanted to know more, to see exactly what it was doing, and to be sure of what it was. Like knowing a serial killer is in your house, but not knowing exactly where. "I almost want to press the brakes to see if I can see it again," I whispered, eyes roaming both fields. "But I don't want it to catch up to us." "Don't," my husband said, head whipping back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of this creature. "I'll have to at the intersection so we don't flip," I said. I put pressure on the brake, eyes back on the mirror, and then I saw it. Front paws, more like hands with claws, to be honest, in the tall grass on the side of the road, while the rest of its body stretched across the dirt road. Its head was turned toward us, eyes piercing like I remembered the other ones being. It was massive, even as it stood on all fours. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, the way it stretched across the road like that, from one side to another. My husband only saw its haunches at that time, but later, the next time our lights went on, he saw its arms. Its front arms were huge, almost gorilla-like, with those bulky muscles that stood out on them. He says he saw its face at one point. It was almost human-like, if that's what you want to call it. It had the muzzle of a dog, but the eyes were definitely human. It had ears like a wolf, but they were laid back, like when a dog is angry. He believes now that those things were definitely out for blood. The way he saw its mouth open, but couldn't see its teeth. I wish I could say the same. Its teeth were huge. I saw it, even in the short glimpse I caught. We started to see the lights from town, and I sped up. I was going 50 now, and this thing was keeping up. I felt my blood pumping through my veins heatedly, too fast. I felt like I was either going to wreck or get eaten alive. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and I saw my husband's brother, still asleep through all of this terror. I couldn't let this thing get him. He was just a kid. So I kept driving, going 50 on a dangerous road, a road that everyone in the county would swear up and down was cursed. At the next intersection, I couldn't see it, but something told me it was on my side. Then it circled back and was on the other side. At one point, my husband and I both swore that it pulled back, almost like it stopped, before starting back up on the passenger side. Wherever it was, we could always feel it, this primal instinctual fear, a sense of location and doom that I'm sure all prey feel before they die. The edge of town grew closer, and I explained my plan to my husband. "I'm not going straight home, okay?" "Why?" "If it's going to follow us, I want to try to throw it off our trail before we go home." "Yeah, I don't want it following us there. What if it ate the cats?" "Well, it's not the cats that I'm worried about," I deadpanned. "I'm talking best case scenario," he answers. The chills from fear seemed to gloss back over me. We got to the very northern edge of town, and the creature seemed to be pulling back, but it was still coming. It definitely didn't like the light, that's for sure. Eventually, about 3 blocks before Main Street, I couldn't see it anymore, let alone feel it. The beast was finally gone. Still, I told my husband, "I'm almost afraid to leave the car when we get home. We locked up the house before we left." "I'll go ahead and wake up Gunner," he said. That's his brother. My husband reached the back seat and shook him awake. "Hey, when I tell you to get out of the car, I want you to run to the house, okay?" Okay," Gunnar said, his voice groggy with sleep, and he was obviously confused. I told my husband, "Give him the house key. He's the fastest. He'll be able to open the door the fastest." We parked the car in the driveway, then we all got up and ran to the house. But I was wrong. It was a nightmare how long it took Gunnar to open the door. My husband and I stood with our backs to him, watching for that beast to show up. I had my car keys ready like a knife, and I finally heard the sweet sound of the lock of the door click before we walked inside. It took the whole night for us to calm down, and I really thought we were going to die out there, either from that beast or the road. I'm just glad that we lost track of it, and I hope we don't come across it again. I probably won't be going down dirt roads at night again anytime soon.
Throughout the day, we take our 2 dogs outside to their kennels so they can get out of the house for a while and run and play. These are not small dogs. One is a black lab husky mix, and the other one is a full-blooded Staffordshire Terrier, also known as pit bulls. The kennels are placed at the edge of the yard near the wood line. These woods are large, huge enough to take a day to go hiking through. Lately, when it gets dark, the dogs seem on edge. They will bark and whine toward the house to come in. At first, I figured they just wanted to get back into the house, but now I'm thinking that they're genuinely scared. 3 nights ago, when I went to get them, it was already dark, but we have a security light, so it isn't pitch black or anything. I got to the front of the first kennel and noticed that both dogs were being quiet. They always bark at me excitedly when I go to get to them, but they were dead silent. This weirded me out a little, but not to the point of being scared. I will admit that there was a certain uneasiness in the air though, something I can't explain. It kind of felt like electricity was in the air, like I was about to be shocked. The longer I was there, the more uneasy I felt. I started getting the first dog, the lab, out and heard a heavy snap in the woods near the kennels. I froze. The dogs froze. By this time, I was so on edge that if somebody had spoken, I would have jumped, screamed, and possibly ran. The creepy feeling in the air just kept getting thicker. The lab had her bushy tail stepped underneath her and was whining. This didn't make me feel any better. The pit bull was far away from the woods as she can get, whimpering for me to come get her. I can only take 1 dog in at a time because they get too excited and will sometimes try to fight, so I avoid that at all costs. I felt so bad leaving the pitty there by herself, but I had to do it. As I walked away, she barked this high-pitched whining type of bark at me that I have never heard her do before. The lab couldn't get to the house quick enough. I went back for the other one and dreaded every step as her door is right at the base of the woods. I would have to turn my back to the woods to open her door and get her out. The air felt heavy and stale, with an unpleasant smell, like rotting meat and wet dog, as I approached the kennel. Another snap, and I was about ready to run for it. But I didn't want to leave my dog, who had her head down defensively, facing the woods. I could barely make it. To be honest, it felt like trying to walk through water. I was terrified by the time I reached the door. I heard a heavy panting behind me as I got my dog out. She was scared too, but starting to growl from what was ever behind me. I was frozen in place. The panting continued for a minute before I heard it get louder, and I heard steps coming toward us. We both took off at the same time. A terrifying howl-like scream came out of the base of the woods, and I didn't dare look back. I just ran. My pity pulled me all the way back to the house. I got in, flipped off all the lights, and stared at the window at the woods. I could see something moving slightly, but just out of the light. It moved back and forth for about 5 minutes, and then disappeared. Whatever it was darker than night itself. It was so dark that it even stood out in the darkness as being something that was darker than the darkness itself. It took me forever to fall asleep that night because I was so scared that every little noise freaked me out. The next night, I went to go get the dogs earlier, right around dusk. I thought all was good until I was getting my pity out again. A huge snapping sound, like a tree branch had just been snapped in half, rang out. It sounded pretty far away, so I just hurriedly got my dog and started toward the house. A few steps away from the kennel, I heard something big start charging toward me from inside the woods. It sounded like it was on 4 legs. We ran again and it appeared to follow for so long, then retreated back. Now, every night then, I hear sounds coming out of the woods, like branches breaking, leaves or brush being stepped on and crushed, heavy panting, low growling, and sometimes an occasional howl. I am absolutely terrified. I no longer even take my dogs down. I just take them for walks during the day and make sure we were all in before dusk. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking about buying a gun, but I'm not sure it will help. Do you guys have any idea what I might be dealing with? And if so, do any of you recommend any good weapons to deal with this issue? Back during my senior year in high school, I was just 18 and probably getting ready to graduate. Living in a more out-of-town area in Oklahoma at the time, this was just any old regular school night. My parents both worked early morning jobs. My dad was a tile guy and kept pretty busy working consistent jobs, so since he and my mother both had to be up early in the morning, they both crashed out pretty early. Around 8 p.m. was their usual bedtime, and so I would always stay up till midnight. Myself, I was a night owl. I enjoyed my nighttime to myself. I could unwind without having to have my dad or mom down my neck about anything. On this night, I was watching TV in my room, just relaxing on my bed. I heard my dog start to growl really loud at something. He was by the back sliding glass doors. It's not really like him to growl at anything. He's a pretty passive dog. So much so that he would make a terrible self-defense animal. He's just an old family dog who's had too much of the good life to be in any way aggressive. So you could see why this alarmed me. I got up out of bed to go see what my dog was growling at. Out in the distance of the night was this hulking, what had to be 10 to 12 feet tall, werewolf with eyes glowing red, walking out along the land while every few strides would stop and stare in our direction. Then just keep moving. I watched this thing for 5 seconds before it moved far enough into the darkness, just to where I couldn't see this thing at all anymore. My dog is beginning to freak out, and being so loud now that my parents are awake. They're pissed, and I just downplay the situation because I know they wouldn't believe me. I just tell them our dog saw something outside. What disturbs me is that looking back, I was terrified after I saw this thing. I must have been pale as a sheet, because even though my parents were pissed that they were awoken, they seemed concerned by how I was acting. After playing it off, they didn't really dig too much deeper, and we all went back to bed. I didn't really sleep until 5 or so in the morning, just a pure exhaustion. I don't know what the hell I saw, and I know it gets crazy out in these parts, but I never knew werewolf-like creatures inhabited this land. The only other thing I can think of is that I know there's a lot of occultism and black magic practiced in these desolate areas. It's possible what I could have saw was a product of that. I'm not too sure. It never did come back, and I never saw it again after that. Okay, so I don't really know how to start the story off, but it just happened like an hour ago, and I'm still spooked. So a bit of a preface. Me and my friend are home alone right now, and have been for a few hours. Every time he comes over, we go to the woods by my house, and it's normally uneventful, with some throwing rocks and breaking trees and stuff. Harmless fun. But this time, something else happened. Like I said, we're home alone and have been for a while, and while this happened, we were obviously home alone. We went outside to go to the woods, and the trip there was uneventful. But once we got there, something was off. Everything was dark, tons of trees had been knocked down, and the entire place was not like I remembered it being. We kept going in, still having our usual harmless fun, and at one point my friend turned to me and said we should go back. I looked at my phone and decided it had only been 30 minutes, and so we might as well stay longer, 'cause it'll be a few hours until anyone would want us to be home. We continued on, finding a few strange things, like an old crushed Mountain Dew can, probably 10 to 20 years old, and a toy boat which had been completely destroyed by the wind and water and other elements of nature, and was probably even older than the can. Our plan was to go further than that I had ever been deeper to the woods, which isn't very hard for us because I've barely been that deep. After walking for a while, we came to a landmark I knew that was marked about the deepest I've ever been in. A while ago, when I was going far in, I came upon a bridge built on a log that had fallen over a river in the middle of the woods. However, one thing was different. There was something sitting on top of it. Whatever was on it was small and resembled the head of an animal. When we got closer and got a good view of it, it was a deer skull, pearly white and clean, sitting on the bridge, with no clue as to who put it there and where the rest of it was. Behind the river, there was a huge hill with a creepy small house on it. And while we were looking around, I heard a low, deep, guttural growl. Like it sounded so low you could feel the vibrations. I freaked out. We began to run, and from behind me, I hear my friend screaming, and I hear him running behind me. We both keep running, and once we reach the edge of the woods, we step out onto the road. As I step out onto the road, I turn around and I see this upright, German Shepherd-looking animal standing where we were. My friend and I both screamed werewolf at the same time. We bolted and we quickly made our way home. And when we got there, the garage door was wide open. Not knowing if it was left open or not, we ran inside, locking the door, checking the house, and turning the alarm on. I hope that thing didn't track our scent and follow us back to the house. I guess I'll start with the background. I'm a 33-year-old female, but this story takes place when I was a teenager, living in a suburb of Chicago. The village I lived in was quiet and middle class. We lived like a mile from the police station, and the worst crimes we had was a murder or two, and a robbery, once in a blue moon. 99% of the time, boring, and more boring. Unless you had a car, you were stuck just walking around the park at night with your friends. Kind of boring. Anyway, one night, my girlfriend and I decided to go hang out at a park with some guys at like midnight. The night was a bit windy and had a full moon. I even got a kiss that night from the boy I liked. But the night wasn't just fun and hanging out late. There's a deep forest in the park with a stream, with a playground right next to it. The same playground we went to, with swings and jumbo gym columns. There's 2 bridges, one of the wooden ones, it's the one that everybody uses, and one bridge made of rocks that's rarely used because it is deeper in the forest over the stream, connecting the 2 halves of the forest park area. I'll get to the rock bridge in a minute. We hung around on the swings and chatted and just spent the evening together. I'm sitting and just looking around, talking and enjoying the peace and quiet and the moonlight. I have a full view of the forest and the dip of the earth that I know that leads to the stream. I see something moving over the dip of the earth. Some dark shape. It looked like it was crawling out of the forest. An arm, then another arm. Then I see this humongous-looking dog head that resembled the Doberman Pinscher's head. It pulls itself out of the ditch/stream, a figure darker than the surrounding forest. And I'm sitting there, frozen. I think I'm seeing things. It just kind of lies there on the ground, but doesn't move. A flash of fear grips me. What if it comes this way? I look to my friends and no one notices anything. I look back and it's gone. Did it go back or somewhere? I really want to get out there and check. Then one friend asks, "Did you guys hear about the urban legend of the rock bridge over the stream? Apparently, some kids or something played on the bridge and fell over and died." What a thing to say after what I saw. I didn't ask anyone anything and just pretended I didn't see a thing. But the experience stuck with me. I never talked about it because I must have really been my imagination. Things like that happen only in scary movies though, right? But I rarely went to the park after that. And the black thing, if you are real, I hope we never meet again. Who knows what would have happened if you would have saw me the same time I saw you? Could it have been the notorious Dogmen that's talked about being seen in the area? I don't know, and I'm glad I didn't find out.
My mom used to tell me this story. Basically, let me tell you a bit about where this took place. It was in a very small town in Canada. It was at night and in the 90s. It's sort of a local story turned urban legend, and my mom always sweared it to be true. One night, a married young woman asked her husband to go and get something for supper. So the man walked to the grocery store in the neighboring town. Half an hour later, and the husband was still not back. The woman set out herself to search for her husband. When she was halfway to the other town, she heard rustling in the bushes behind her up the hill. She didn't pay it much mind, as she assumed it was just animals. Many of them became more active in the night. And that's when she heard the growling, and before she could run, the animal had attacked her. With the brightness of the full moon, she got a good look at it. The creature was large and covered in fur, brown fur to be exact. It had large, menacing teeth, and it attacked her legs. She panicked, kicking her legs about until she struck it, leaving a wicked scratch on its face. The woman got away, and the animal followed her. It was on twos at first, until it got down on all fours and ran faster than an average wolf. All of a sudden, lights headed toward them, and the animal vanished. Luckily, the lights came from her neighbor. She got into the car with them, and she told her everything. When she got home, her husband was sitting down, and he had a deep scratch on his face. How did he get home so quick, and how did he get that scratch? Was he the Rougarou? Before I tell you my story, I will tell you some background about myself. I'm not from the USA, as you might think. I'm from Europe, from the Netherlands to be more precise. Normally I don't believe in such things as werewolves or ghosts, which isn't odd for a Dutchman. The Dutch are hard to convince of supernatural or mythical stuff like this. As for me, I love nature. I love photography, drawing, and writing. When the first snow had fallen here during the first week of January, I went to the woods near my house to take photos of the beautiful white landscape. I rode to the forest on my mountain bike. At the time, the sun would be setting in about half an hour, so I had to take my photos quickly. Here you're not allowed to be in the woods after sunset or before dawn, and you're not allowed to camp on the property. Each and every night, the gates close at the same time, right after sunset. When I arrived, I chained my bike to a tree and went on, walking and taking photos. All went just as planned, except I took a bit too long and did not get out in time. The sun was already out of the sky when I came back, and the forest slowly started to come to life. I saw deer, a fox, but then I saw something else, something dark and big, and when I looked closer, I thought it was a wolf or a wild dog. It had bright yellow eyes and two sharp white fangs sticking out from under the upper lip. I saw the head from profile, but its body was almost frontal view. It was then that I could tell this was no wolf, because it had the torso and the arms of a person, and the back legs, tail, and fur, of course, of a wolf. It looked like it was listening or looking for something. My heart seemed to stop, and I froze in place, completely and utterly petrified. This large creature stood not much more than 30 meters from me, and I hesitated whether to take a picture or just to run away. But if I took a photo, it'd be a once-in-a-lifetime thing, so I chose that. But the moment I raised the camera, the beast moved its ears, indicating that it had heard me. Then it turned its head right toward me. At that moment, my whole body wanted to give out. I thought I was going to die. For the first time in my life, I felt real, palpable dread. Its gaze met mine, that intense look. The creature stared right into my soul. At least, that's what it felt like. When it came closer to me, slowly and almost curiously, as if it had never seen a person before, there was no aggression, though that's what I had expected. Just curiosity. I was still frozen, and I could not move a muscle. The beast now stood less than 10 feet away from me. With no snarl on its face, it sniffed the air, probably smelling my scent. I hoped whatever it was didn't suddenly change its mood and would attack me, because I would definitely be finished then. By now, there was hardly any space between us. But the beast did nothing, and as quickly as I could blink, this creature jumped right at me, letting out a short and soft growl, almost like a threat, but oddly enough, it didn't bare its teeth. I took a step back, and it took a step forward. By now I knew, if it wasn't going to kill me, it wanted me out of the woods. So I continued to walk back, facing it, until what felt like an eternity later, it finally turned around and ran away, back into the now dark depths of the forest. I fell to the ground, knees hitting the dirt. I realized what I had just seen, a werewolf, to put it bluntly, and to think, if that creature had just been a little bit more hungry, I would have been dead. I stood up and ran back to my bike and unlocked it as fast as I could before that thing changed its mind. I raced back home, and I looked through all the pictures I took, hoping that I caught a glimpse of the creature by accident on different pictures. But there was nothing there. So instead, while it was fresh in my mind, I decided to draw what I saw. And ever since then, I haven't been back, and I haven't told anyone else this story. I don't think anyone would believe me anyway, especially none of my skeptic Dutch family. All in all, though, despite knowing that that thing does not want me there, I want to go back, and I plan on heading back there soon.
This happened back in 1991. What I'm about to share with you was probably one of the most terrifying and horrific experiences of my life. For starters, I lived in Oklahoma and would prefer to not disclose the location. I liked keeping to myself, and I liked things private. I'm not a huge people person and have never been. To me, I find peace in solitude and isolation. I always have. I don't really have that many neighbors, and the nearest one is a little ways away. I've never had any issues in the past with people coming onto my property or up to my house, which is one of the reasons why I live out where I do. However, I'm still fairly well trained in self-defense and keep weapons around my house, just in case of anything. When it comes to weapons, I don't mess around. I don't aim to injure or to stun. I aim to kill, because at that point, I'm going against an intruder who's going after my life. Right next to my bedside, I keep a little Smith & Wesson's .44 Magnum. It's not meant to kill a bear, but it's definitely going to take someone down who comes into my house to hurt me. I know family and friends have called me crazy for keeping weapons like that around, but I don't trust people. I haven't had the brightest past, and it makes me feel safe. On this particular night that I'm going to tell you about, reassured me that the weapons I keep are more than suitable. I don't ever feel the need to have surveillance systems or anything like that around my house. I've never had intruders before, like I said. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so I've always trusted my gut and instinct to alert me in the throes of danger. It's helped me out before, and this instance was no different. I awoke to the sound of glass shattering at about 2:30 or so in the morning. I then heard the door handle jiggle violently, and the back door bust open. It sounded like someone was using a battering ram to get through. I immediately went into code red, as I knew someone had broken into my home. I laid there quiet in bed as I heard the sound of heavy thudding. Whoever this was must have been big, or wearing heavy boots or something. Immediately, I reached over to my end of the table and pulled out my gun, and I slowly sat up out of bed. Outside of my bedroom is a long, straight hallway that leads down to my kitchen where the back door is. Whoever this was making an awful lot of noise and wasn't even trying to keep quiet. There was so much rustling and noise. I thought how strange this was. Then, it went completely silent. I stood up and crept quietly by my door and waited, debating with myself if I should go and investigate or not. I tightly gripped my weapon and opened up my door and pointed my gun down my dark hallway. What I saw next took my breath away. I will have nightmares about this for a long time, and I'm having a hard time writing this. The first thing I saw when I pointed my weapon down the hallway were eyes. Two glowing amber-colored eyes looking back at me. These eyes were on something of massive size, barely able to fit in my hallway. Whatever this was slowly approaching me, coming down the hallway. I was frozen in place, my jaw dropped, and I felt the most primal fear anyone could ever feel. There's a window on the side of my hallway that shone light in from the moon. As this thing stepped closer to me, it became more visible in the moonlight. I was able to see more and more details. It stopped and slowly lowered its head right before the window. I could make out clearly that it was a giant hairy wolf standing on two legs. With the most intense stare I've ever felt from any animal, this thing pulled back its gums and exposed its teeth and growled at me menacingly. My hand froze on the gun, but I knew this animal was getting ready to pounce and end my life. The next moments were a blur. Between continuously firing my magnum and the screams and howls I heard, there was a lot of blood. After I emptied the entire gun into this thing, I still kept trying to pull the trigger, only to get the click-click sound as the chamber was empty. Whatever I encountered was now dead. This thing was now a bloody, mangled mess of fur. I didn't even want to get near it and check if it was dead. I stood there for a moment and silence overcame the area. I still had my gun pointed at this thing, waiting for it to get back up. After just a few more moments, I lowered my gun. I couldn't step over this thing to go outside since its body was blocking up the entire hallway, and blood being everywhere. There was so much gore. I walked back into my bedroom and called the police. I told them that a large animal had broken in and tried to kill me, but I killed it. Within 10 minutes, 5 cop cars pulled up on my property. I was still shaken up with what had happened, and multiple officers were coming in the house, asking and yelling to me if I was okay. They saw the body of whatever that thing was. They told me to stay where I was until they could remove the body to get to me. After some more time had passed, multiple officers had managed to move enough of this thing's mangled body to reach me. Instead of being asked if I was okay and being properly treated, I was detained and put in the cop car. I wasn't told a thing, and the officers all talked in hushed tones about what the situation entailed. I was taken down to the station and basically told I wasn't allowed back to my house. They said my property now belonged to the federal government and was going to be needed for surveying, they told me. They put me up in a motel for a few days and gave me some options of other states to go. I eventually moved back west where my grandparents had owned property and I had other family there in the area. I eventually was able to rework my life, but I'll never understand what happened that night. What was that thing I encountered, and why did the police and government have the right to strip my property out from underneath my feet? I live in Texarkana. Well, actually, right outside of town, and I witnessed something that I can't explain. I went out drinking with a couple of buddies of mine. I'm only in high school, so drinking is not something we could legally do yet. Me and my buddies took his pickup truck and parked in a much more secluded area just to have a few beers in peace and bullshit. My friend just started dating this really hot girl, and so we all wanted the details on that. We had driven a little ways into the thicker forested area, a little ways out of town, but I knew we wouldn't be bothered by police out there. During the summer, this area is pretty peaceful. I think there's even a nearby creek too, because you could hear it if you listen closely. We're sitting by ourselves, all having a few beers, and talking about how things are getting hot with my friend and his woman. And we begin to hear weird rustling noises. It sounded like something big moving around in the woods close by. We were cautious, but weren't too scared. it was probably just a deer. We resumed our conversation and then began to hear some strange growling noises. The weirdest thing is, the growling was so deep and bassy. There was no way this was just a big dog. It sounded huge. We were all a little more alert after this because we were starting to wonder what was going on. Like out of a movie, out pops this huge dog head about 30 feet away. All of us drop our beer as the only thing we see is the silhouette of this huge head and glowing red eyes staring at us. Intoxicated or not, we got the hell out of there so fast. We weren't quite sure what we had seen, but this thing was huge. I don't know if someone was trying to play a prank on us or what, but nothing will be able to explain the heavy rustling I heard. We all felt dread too, right before this thing popped its head out to show itself. We only looked at it for a few seconds before wanting to fly out. None of us really talked about it, and I don't want to go back to that area. I don't know if it was a werewolf or a demon or what. I'm not really sure if there's any explanation for what it could have been. I didn't like the way it made me feel. I didn't like the vibe it gave off. I felt like it wanted to hurt us and that we didn't belong there. I'm glad we never stuck around to find out. This happened back in the winter of '93. I was having a nice family dinner at my girlfriend's parents' place. They had just bought this huge house and property out in the boonies and invited me out for a big dinner. After dinner, I was driving back home, and their driveway connects to a long gravel road that eventually leads out to the main road. This was around 8 or so at night, so it was pitch black outside. As I'm driving on this gravel road, I'm only doing about 20 miles an hour. I see these ears pop up on the right side of the road in the ditch, and I first think to myself, what kind of dog is that? Then, this thing stands up on 2 legs and walks over the road into the woods. This thing was holding a dead deer in its arms. This thing was actually holding a dead deer and was clearly eating it. It had blood on its muzzle and all over its hands. My headlights shined on it enough in those few seconds of it crossing the road for me to see enough. I just stopped the car, threw it in reverse, and drove back to my girlfriend's parents' place and stayed the night. I told them I felt ill and needed to sleep because I knew they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had seen. I didn't notice any eye shine or huge fangs or anything like that. It just looked like a big wolf that was standing on 2 legs, fairly large and hairy, just like a wolf would be. I didn't really pay attention to much of the face other than the blood on its muzzle. I was more concerned that it was holding a deer in its hands, and I must have interrupted its meal. I'm glad I wasn't the next meal.